So this is called Motivating the Rules of the Game for Adversarial Example Research. It's joint work with Ian Goodfellow, Ryan Adams, George Dahl, and also David Anderson, who should be on there. Okay, so we're going to talk about evasion attacks against machine learning systems. So what is an evasion attack? Say we have a machine learning system deployed in the wild. It takes inputs X and it makes predictions Y. This is kind of slow. Here, I'll just use the laptop. Okay. An evasion attack is when an adversary, say Mallory, comes along and is going to adversarially construct an input in a way that is going to cause some undesirable behavior of the machine learning system. An example of evasion attack, which should be familiar to everyone, is spam email. So, adversaries are constantly trying to construct spam emails in a way that evade automatic spam detection, and defenders are constantly trying to update their spam detectors in a way that accounts for new attacks. Now, a recent kind of adversarial example that's garnered a lot of research interest recently is the notion of an imperceptible adversarial example. So in 2014, maybe in 2013, it was discovered that you could basically construct carefully crafted imperceptible noise that when you apply it to an image causes a state-of-the-art image classifier to output the wrong answer. So here on the left is a picture of a panda. The model correctly classifies it as a panda. And this paper showed that you could basically construct very carefully crafted noise in a way that will cause the model to say it's a gibbon. And this is kind of interesting because the starting image and the resulting image look virtually indistinguishable to a human. And yet to the model it clearly looks very different. So, and this is an intriguing phenomenon. People have been studying it a lot, but this is often cited as a major security concern, and that's sort of what I want to address today. Okay, so before I get into that, how are they found? So the way you construct an imperceptible adversarial example is you take a starting image, and you're going to define some sort of search region in image space, and you're basically going to solve an optimization problem. So you're basically going to say, let's search over all images near this image in a way that maximizes model loss. So we're going to do gradient descent in pixel space. And so basically, if you define your objective function, you do a couple steps of gradient descent, you typically arrive at an image that the model incorrectly classifies. And basically, this works for virtually every state-of-the-art vision model that I'm aware of. So since their discovery, there's been adversarial attacks demonstrated against many systems. Recent work showed that you could fool medical imaging with imperceptible adversarial examples. So here, I guess on the left, there's retina scans that this is a model that's trained to recognize, I think, diabetic retinopathy. And this work showed that you could take either a healthy eye and add very carefully crafted imperceptible noise to it in a way that the model says it's sick. And you could take a sick eye and turn it into a healthy eye. And also this has been shown for like X-ray and also other data sets. We also have adversarial stop signs demonstrated where people show that you can construct place carefully crafted stickers on a stop sign in a way that will cause the model to classify it as a speed limit sign. And people have shown adversarial attacks against the Google Cloud service as well. So on the left is a picture that's correctly classified as skiing, and on the right is the picture that the model says is a dog. Okay, and since their discovery, there's been a ton of papers trying to basically defend against this. So there's 100 defenses that are proposed to try to improve robustness to small perturbations. And if you read these papers, you'll see quotes like, this undesirable property of deep networks has become a major security concern in real-world applications, such as self-driving cars and identity recognition, and adversarial examples pose a great security danger to the deployment of commercial machine learning systems. And not everyone's using this rhetoric. I think some people are studying this sort of as sort of a toy game and trying to understand it better. But what I want to talk about today is just what are the security implications of this phenomenon? So I want to take the idea of an adversarial example seriously as a security threat and really just try to understand, for deployed machine learning systems, what are the concerns that we should be aware that we should be worried about, and how should we try to approach this problem? And in particular, machine learning models make lots of errors. There's test error. If you deploy a machine learning model with, say, slightly out of distribution, performance drops greatly. So in particular, this picture here, this is a test error. So this is Inception v3. It's one of the state-of-the-art image models. It has 3.5% top 5 error rate on the test set, which is kind of interesting because that's actually superhuman in a sense. But that's sort of a misleading metric because models are much better at humans at differentiating between different breeds of dogs. And so primarily the reason why the model is so good, at least in this metric of test error, is because it sort of has this domain expertise in like dog breeds and sort of these obscure kind of animals. But if you dig into the test set, you will see plenty of model errors that a human would definitely not make. Here is a picture that the model is very confident is a burrito. And I think we can all agree here that there's no burrito in this picture. Here's a picture of a police car. The model is very confident is a taxi cab. This is a hairspray can the model thinks is a beer bottle. And these images were not adversarially modified at all. This is just, you just sample images at random, you will see errors like this. Okay, and other work has recently shown that you can fool models by, say, like rotating or translating an image. So on the left here is a picture of the model says is a revolver, and the author showed that you could basically rotate the image in a way that the model says is a mousetrap. And I believe they're just applying rotations at random. They're not like using gradient descent or anything. It's just you just randomly like mess with the image. And on the bottom here is a picture. The model says a vulture, and if you rotate again, the model says it's an orangutan. I did my own little investigation. So this is an MNIST model. This is actually one of the adversarial defense papers. So this is the state-of-the-art defense that it was trained to resist basically small adversarial perturbations of the input. And indeed, this model was hard to break with like small changes to the image, but it was very easy to break with respect to other changes. So all I did here was basically define a distribution of lines and applied lines at random. So here's a 0 I turned into a 2. The 7 I turned into a 9. The 4 I turned into a 9. 0 became an 8, and the 1 became a 4. And I only needed 6 queries on average to fool the model in this case. So what this means is, like, this were a deployed system and the attacker did this, they would only need to try 6 times before they would break it. Okay, so are these sort of error security concerns as well, is sort of the question I'm asking. Anyway, so I think to study security, we should first understand the threat. So let's do some threat modeling. So what does the attacker know about the system? You can imagine a setting where the attacker has complete knowledge. The attacker knows the model weights, architecture, basically everything. You can consider settings where the attacker has partial knowledge. Maybe the attacker knows the training data. Maybe the model, or maybe the attacker is just familiar with general sort of machine learning techniques in the area. Or you could just consider query access, where the attacker doesn't know the data or the model architecture or anything, and is just allowed to just sort of like probe the model randomly. And so as you go right to left, you get a stronger attacker. So as the attacker knows more stuff, they can apply more powerful techniques. And if you go left to right, you get a higher likelihood attack. And what I mean by that is, most or many attackers haven't read machine learning papers. They don't know the state-of-the-art adversarial attacks. They're probably just going to try really dumb stuff if they're going to try to break a model. And so, these sort of dumb query attacks, sort of like the Lions attack that I described earlier, I think are much more likely to be encountered. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about stronger attacks, but I think the most likely attacks we'll encounter are these sort of like silly high likelihood attacks. Okay, what is the action space and goal of the attacker? So, what control does Mallory have over the input X, and what is she trying to achieve? In particular, why is she restricted in her modification? So why is she trying to make an imperceptible change to an image? Could she do this instead? And actually, why is she perturbing anything? If she can change every pixel of the image by a little bit, she could change every pixel of the image by a lot. And so maybe she could just feed in a completely different image. And this makes something we call the test set attack possible. So if you have a model that misclassifies 1% of pandas, and the attacker just samples images of pandas at random, they will eventually find a model error. And so, based on these sort of I want to sort of distinguish between two broad categories of attack settings. On the left is settings where the attacker has full control of the input. They can basically supply any image to the model that they want. And on the right is where the attacker sort of handed an image and needs to perturb it in some way. And sort of in this two broad categories, we sort of defined a taxonomy of 5 different attack settings. First one is what we call the content constrained input. So here is where Mallory produces any input X that contains some desired content or payload. So an example is image spam. And so here, this is an actual adversarial example that was constructed by a real attacker. It's a bit dated of an attack. This was back in the days of image spam. This is back in 2006, where basically spam detectors became pretty good, and so to get around spam detection, attackers started to upload image attachments in their spam to deliver their spam content. And then defenders basically noticed that attackers started to do that, so defenders would train machine learning models to basically scan every image attachment and try to detect those for spam. And then once defenders started to do that, attackers started to modify their images adversarially in a way to evade statistical detection. And this is sort of what naturally arose out of that kind of cat and mouse game. Where the attacker, you can see the image that they generated, it has some sort of spam content. It's talking about World Street Report or World Stock Report, or whatever. But they applied a whole bunch of like funky symbols and stuff in the background, and that's sort of like the adversarial modification that the attacker applied to get around the system. And if you sort of imagine the design space of the attacker here, it's really any image that contains the spam content but gets past statistical detection. It's very different from they were handed an image and needs to like imperceptibly modify it. Here's a huge space of images and they just search that broad space. Okay, next setting is what we call the non-suspicious input. So here, this attack setting is where Mallory can basically choose any X to a human that to a human would appear to be real. And one example is what we call the voice assistant attack. So this is a bit contrived of an example, but you can imagine a more realistic variant of this. But suppose Mallory and Bob are sitting at home, and Bob has a voice assistant. And Mallory wants to sort of mess with Bob, so Mallory wants the voice assistant to purchase 100 pizzas. But Mallory does not, but Bob's sitting right next to Mallory, so Mallory could just say, hey, voice assistant, order 100 pizzas, but that would arouse the suspicion of Bob, and Mallory doesn't want Bob to realize she's doing this. So Mallory needs to basically produce some adversarial audio in a way that to Bob doesn't realize that Mallory is saying order 100 pizzas, but the voice assistant interprets the audio as purchase 100 pizzas. And if you think about the design space for Mallory in this case, it's basically any non-suspicious audio is possible. So it could be subtle white noise, she could take some music and adversarially modify it, etc. And this has been demonstrated to people shown adversarial attacks against, say, like Siri, where you take music and adversarially modify in a way that Siri calls 911, or they also do like sort of imperceptible or like basically just subtle white noise in a way that causes Siri to issue a command. Okay, next part is what we call the unconstrained input. This is sort of a worst case scenario for the defender. This is just where there's just no constraints on the attacker at all. An example of this is the iPhone Face ID unlock. And so the iPhone Face ID, maybe people are familiar with it, it's a system that you can unlock your phone by just scanning your face. And people have shown that you can adversarially break that system by basically reconstructing a 3D model of the owner's face. Takes a bit of work, but people have shown it's possible. And the reason why so this is sort of an adversarial example for the Face ID system, and the reason why it's a 3D model is the iPhone uses multiple systems when classifying. So they have a face, they have face image recognizer. They also have a 3D depth map that they look at, and they also look at a heat map of the face. And so in order to fool that system, you sort of need to fool 3 systems at once. Right, so next is what we call the content preserving perturbation. So this is where malware wishes to perturb a particular input X in a way that preserves content. An example of this is what we call the pay-per-view attack. So in the pay-per-view attack, so one example of pay-per-view attack is, so suppose Mallory has a copyrighted Panda documentary that she wants to upload to NetBeatTube. But NetBeatTube has a copyright detector, and so if she just uploads the video directly, the copyright detector will see it and basically say, that's copyrighted, take that down. And so what Mallory needs to do is basically modify the video in a way that the copyright detector no longer recognizes the video. And so if you sort of imagine the space of content preserving perturbations, it's basically any change to the video that to a human viewer, they can still enjoy the movie, but to the model, the model thinks it's a different movie. So you can imagine Mallory could apply a bunch of funky symbols. She could rotate or translate the video. She could also crop it and apply a funky background. And this is actually what people do. So here is an actual adversarial example for YouTube where the attacker uploaded a movie in a way that got past the copyright detector. And so it's sort of a funky looking picture. It looks like 2 pictures. This is what the video looks like. And the attacker applied, I guess, this like funky sort of 360 translation to the movie that the resulting movie, the model doesn't recognize that it's a movie anymore, but a human viewer could still watch and enjoy this. Believe it or not, this is what attackers actually do, and people actually watch this. These movies are all over YouTube. And another common attack in this variant is where the attacker sort of refilms the television screen. That seems to be a pretty effective one. This is an example of what I was talking about with limited query attacks. So real-world attackers sort of prefer the easiest thing to do. And if the attacker had access to the model weights, they might have been able to construct an imperceptible perturbation to the movie, which would sort of maximize the viewer's enjoyment. But the attacker didn't do that. And the reason why is because finding that imperceptible perturbation is really difficult. If you don't, like the attacker did not have access to the model weights here. People have shown you can still do imperceptible adversarial attacks without the model weights, but doing that requires basically training your own model, performing an adversarial attack on that model, and then hoping it transfers to the defender's model. And so for the attacker to do that, they would need to collect a whole data set of movies. They would need to try to reconstruct the copyright detector, perform an adversarial attack on their proxy model, and then hope it transfers. That's a lot of work. This was much easier, and this is what the attacker did. Okay, so last is the indistinguishable perturbation. So this is where attackers hand an image and needs to apply imperceptible noise to it that fools the model, but to a human they can't notice any change. It's hard to come up with examples where this makes sense. Machine learning is deployed everywhere. We sort of try to brainstorm, are there any settings where you would actually need to defend against imperceptible adversarial examples? We weren't able to find any. In some settings, imperceptibly might strengthen the attack, but it's just not required. So in the YouTube copyright setting, the attacker would prefer to upload the imperceptible movie, but the moment you defend against that, the attacker is just going to make slightly larger modifications to the movie to get by your defense. And I think there's been some confusion in the media and research where I think a lot of people think that this is the threat, and that's sort of what we were trying to do with our paper and this talk, is to just say, the threat is much worse than this. Attackers can do a whole lot more things than just this. And I think the authors that originally discovered this phenomenon did not intend for this to be a threat model. But it's being interpreted as a threat model, which we're hoping to correct. Anyway, moving forward, I think we need to start thinking like real attackers. And so, with regard to adversarial stop signs, this is potentially a threat, but this took a team of grad students, a couple weeks to pull off. They used the model weights. And this is not always going to be robust to lighting and perspective changes. So, maybe if you view the stop sign from this angle, the model says a speed limit sign, but it's from a different angle that's no longer a speed limit sign. I think if you think from the eyes of the attacker, there's far easier ways to mess with computer vision system of a self-driving car. Maybe they go outside and knock over a stop sign. This is much easier to pull off, and this would be 100% robust to lighting and perspective changes. So. And that doesn't mean that this isn't a threat. Attackers could do this, but I still think that you don't need gradient descent or model weights to fool the model in this case. Remember the attack that I showed on the MNIST model, all I did was apply these lines at random. I think if you did something similar for stop signs, you might be successful. So if you just apply a bunch of black tape on a stop sign, I think most state-of-the-art stop sign detectors would be fooled. Now, I wouldn't freak out about self-driving cars. I think self-driving car systems might have a map of where every stop sign is in the city, and so they might not actually be reliant on stop sign detection when driving. Okay, good. Okay, so what should we do about this problem? How do we defend against these attacks? How do we measure the security of our models? So in terms of defense, I think all of machine learning is trying to fix this problem. We're all trying to make our models better. We're all trying to reduce test error. And if we want models that don't classify paper towels as burritos, I don't really know what to do other than make the model better. If I knew how to defend against that, if I knew how to get zero test error, I would write that paper and basically solve supervised learning. But I don't know how to defend against that, unfortunately. And I like test error as a metric because this is sort of our best estimate of the error rate of the model. And unfortunately, if test error is zero, or is not zero, that sort of already means the classifier is vulnerable. I mean, if your model makes errors, there are errors for the adversaries to find. I think depending on the system and threat model you're trying to secure, your definition of test error might vary. So if you're trying to defend against spam email, your test error is basically, what's my error rate on, the last, couple of months of spam content. You might be constantly curating a data set and trying to reduce error rate in that data set. You might be trying to anticipate future spam attacks, and so you might augment your data set, but ultimately that is sort of what determines your test error, and that's sort of the metric that you're trying to optimize. If attackers are doing stuff like this, you could try to do massive data augmentation. So you might try to train on every possible sort of modification an attacker could apply to a movie. You might identify common attack strategies that attackers use and train on that. And even sort of anticipate and train on new potential attack distributions. But unfortunately, test errors probably still need bigger than zeros. You're probably not secure in the worst case, but at least you might make it harder for these limited query attackers to get past your system. You might force them to use more queries at least. And I think a particular difficulty that our models have is so they're sort of brittle in the data distribution. They're also extremely brittle outside the data distribution. So even though models seem extremely accurate, the moment you evaluate them out of the data distribution, the test error just plummets. And so I think trying to tackle this out of distribution problem is a very interesting one. It also seems very difficult. I don't think anyone really knows how to get models to generalize well outside the data distribution that they were trained on. So I could imagine future papers trying to train on regular MNIST and try to test on MNIST with lines on it or something. In terms of securing actual systems, there might be other ways to increase security that will allow you to deploy a model that makes errors. So the iPhone Face ID unlock makes mistakes, but the designers of that system sort of made it very difficult for attackers to break by deploying like 3 systems at once, right? So they use the face recognition, they use the 3D depth map, they use the heat map of the face, and those systems together at least make it difficult to break. Still in the worst case, it doesn't work. There have even been instances of like, I think in China, there was like a lawsuit where one lady, like her friend, like could unlock her phone by just, the phone thought they were the same person. So, test error is not 0. All right. Other metrics, I could imagine, just based on the system, different metrics that we should use, but I think we should motivate those metrics by the system and the actual threat that we're trying to defend against. Okay, yeah, but again, for most threat models, if test error is not 0, we're just probably not secure. It doesn't mean we shouldn't deploy machine learning. I mean, spam detection works really well. It's not a perfect system, but my inbox is not, plagued with spam. So, okay, now defending against this, improving, robustness of small adversarial perturbations, unfortunately, this is sort of an extremely constrained attack model, and I don't mean we shouldn't study this. Like, this is interesting, but my sort of complaint about these 100 papers that I mentioned is that our best attempts to try to fix this increase test error. So, we're sort of making it hard for an attacker to apply a very small perturbation, but then we're making it easier for the dumb limited query attackers to get by the system. And so I don't see the point of techniques that defend against small perturbations but increase test error. And also just our efforts to defend against this, they just don't generalize to larger perturbations. So the moment you defend against very small perturbations, attackers, you can just apply a slightly larger one and it still works. This is interesting. We should study it, but I just want people to be clear why they're studying it, and in particular, just try to motivate their work. Right now, if you read the introductions to these papers, it's like self-driving cars, security, like death, and unfortunately, the problem is much broader than this. Okay, so in conclusion, ML classifiers are extremely brittle. But if we want to study security, we should do proper realistic threat modeling. And I think we should start thinking about like actual attackers. What's the easiest way to break a system? What's the most likely attacks that we're likely to encounter? And there's plenty of ML security work that I think does this well. Spam detection has been around for years, and spam detection papers really articulate the threat model well, and they understand what they're trying to defend against. The same goes for malware detection. But this recent sort of imperceptible attack constraint just seems extremely restrictive. And I think we should study. Unfortunately, in the worst case, it seems like we're kind of screwed. But at least in the meantime, we can try to study high likelihood attacks in defense. We can at least try to reduce test error, make it harder for attackers that are just trying silly things to get past the model. So what systems are critical to secure? What attacks are most likely to consider? And again, just tie the metrics to the system being secured. Okay, that's about it. Cool.